We see daily attacks by Russia on Ukrainian cities, on critical infrastructure. So what Russia tries to do is to weaponize winter, to deprive civilian Ukrainians of water, of electricity, of heating when they're now going into winter. And this is a brutal kind of warfare that actually affects all civilians, and it shows the brutality of the Russian invasion, and of course Ukraine has the right to defend itself against these kind of attacks.
I'll dive right into it. As I was saying in my introduction, I was in Kyiv a couple of weeks ago, and I was really struck by the confidence of Ukrainians, not only their resilience, but their confidence. They now speak of winning the war next year and recapturing all of the territory, not even just the territory occupied in February 24. So let me ask you first, do you think that next year we will see a return to the February 24 lines at least?
First of all, I think we need to understand that wars are very hard to predict. NATO was very precise in predicting the invasion. We actually disclosed shared intelligence more than 1 year ago, last fall, many months before the invasion, saying exactly what was actually going to happen, that Russia was preparing a full-fledged invasion of Ukraine. So when the invasion happened, we were well prepared. We activated our defense plans, and we deployed tens of thousands of more troops in the eastern part of the alliance, and we started to provide even more support to Ukraine. What we see now is that Russia is actually attempting to try to have some kind of freeze of this war, at least for a short period of time, so they can regroup, repair, recover, and then try to launch a bigger offensive next spring. So what we do is that we support Ukraine in their right for self-defense. Ukraine is defending their own country, and NATO allies and partners are providing unprecedented support to those efforts by the Ukrainians.
This freeze is what the Ukrainians are most worried about, because they think that what will eventually happen is the longer this freeze lasts, the more war fatigue there will be in the West. Do you worry about that as well?
I think we need to understand that President Putin made two big strategic mistakes when he decided to invade Ukraine. The first was to totally underestimate the Ukrainians, the bravery, the courage of the Ukrainian armed forces, the Ukrainian people, and also the Ukrainian political leadership with President Zelensky. But he also underestimated the strength of NATO allies, partners, in our commitment to stand by Ukraine, to support Ukraine. NATO allies have supported Ukraine for many years, especially since 2014. Especially allies like the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom have trained the Ukrainian armed forces, so they were much bigger, much stronger, much better equipped in February 2022 than when Russia invaded the first time in 2014. So what we have demonstrated over years, and especially since the invasion, is that allies are ready to support Ukraine, because they realize that if Putin wins, it will be a tragedy for the Ukrainians, but it will also be extremely serious for all of us. It will make NATO allies more vulnerable and the world more dangerous, and therefore we cannot allow President Putin to win.
So let me ask you this: should NATO members, given the state of the conflict right now, should NATO members be willing to give the kind of offensive weapons like tanks and advanced fighter jets that will allow Ukrainian forces to break this freeze and not to give any advantage to Russians?
NATO allies have and are providing an unprecedented level of military support to Ukraine, also with modern systems. Allies have provided armored vehicles, also battle tanks, advanced air defense systems, and a wide range of different weapons. But I cannot go into the specific systems we are now considering. We are always considering to add more systems. But I think that as important as adding new systems is to ensure that the systems, the weapons we have already delivered, are actually operational, are working in an effective way, meaning that they need a vast amount of ammunition, spare parts, and also maintenance. So, for instance, we have advanced HIMARS systems. We have advanced air defense systems like the NASAMS or the Krotal and the IRIS-T from Germany. So yes, we are considering constantly what kind of systems we should deliver, but it's extremely important to ensure that the systems which are already there are operational with the ammunition, spare parts, and all the support they need.
You would have definitely noticed, and probably you're studying what happened only yesterday when drones were used to attack a Russian military base. Can you tell us much about these drones? Did you know that Ukrainians were making these drones?
I have no more information about those specific incidents, but what I can say is that what we see is that Ukraine is defending themselves, and we need to understand this in the wider context. We see daily attacks by Russia on Ukrainian cities, on critical infrastructure. So what Russia tries to do is to weaponize winter, to deprive civilian Ukrainians of water, of electricity, of heating when they're now going into winter. And this is a brutal kind of warfare that actually affects all civilians, and it shows the brutality of the Russian invasion, and of course Ukraine has the right to defend itself against these kind of attacks.
We're hearing more noises about the need to launch negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. It's something that makes Ukrainians very nervous. It's not clear what Russia's position is. Do you think it is time for negotiations?
It has to be Ukraine that decides when and the conditions for negotiations. And of course, they are also concerned about these attempts by Russia to try to have a kind of short break or a short freeze of the conflict, so Russia can cover their troops, regroup, and then launch a bigger offensive later on, because now Ukraine has the momentum. Most wars, and most likely also this war, will end at the negotiating table. But we know that what happens around that table is absolutely dependent on the situation on the battlefield. So if you want an outcome of those negotiations which ensures that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent nation, you need to provide military support to Ukraine. And an only lasting peace will be has to be a just peace. If the aggressor wins, that will not give us a lasting peace. So the paradox is that the more we want a peaceful negotiated solution ensuring that Ukraine prevails, the more urgent it is that we provide military support to Ukraine to create the conditions for a just lasting peace
so
in Ukraine.
What I'm hearing from you is that the conditions are not there yet.
The conditions are not there now because Russia has shown no sign of engaging in negotiations which are respecting the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And again, it's not for NATO, it's not for Brussels to decide. It's for Ukrainians to decide when the time is right to start to negotiate and to agree the conditions. This is about a sovereign, independent, democratic nation, which is defending itself against the war of aggression. And of course, they have the right to defend themselves. We support them. The right of self-defense is enshrined in the UN treaty, and that's also the reason why we support them.
From what we hear, there are qualms in some capitals today about the idea of Ukraine retaking the Crimean Peninsula by force, because that could potentially push Moscow to nuclear escalation. Do you share these concerns?
Again, we need to understand what this is. This is a war of aggression. Russia has illegally annexed, invaded another country, Ukraine. And we are supporting Ukraine. At some stage, this war will most likely end at the negotiating table, but the likelihood of any acceptable outcome increases with our support to Ukraine. It's absolutely linked on what happens on the battlefield. Then let me also add that what we have seen, this nuclear rhetoric from Russia, from the Russian side, especially earlier this fall, is reckless, is dangerous, and Russia must know that any use of nuclear weapons would totally change the character, the nature of the conflict, and a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought.
How do you think NATO members can deter Russia from nuclear escalation? And do you think, a few weeks ago, when there was a lot of talk about tactical nuclear, the use of tactical nuclear weapons, was that a bit exaggerated?
I think what we saw more some weeks ago than now was a lot of rhetoric from Moscow, from President Putin, that increased concerns among NATO allies and others about the potential use of these weapons. We have seen less of that recently, but we remain vigilant. We monitor closely what Russia is doing, and we send a very clear, and allies have sent a very clear message to Russia that it will have severe consequences for Russia, and also, of course, that the nuclear war must never be fought.
What have you learned about Vladimir Putin over the past year? And do you think he can survive losing this war?
So what we have learned is his willingness to use brutal force to achieve his political goals. And that's exactly why it is important that he doesn't win, because if President Putin wins in Ukraine, it will also end with the outcome that an independent sovereign nation in Europe has been attacked by another nation, and aggressor wins. That will also send a very bad message to authoritarian leaders all over the world, and also to President Putin, that when they use brutal military force, when they violate international law, when they invade another country, they can achieve what they want. And that will embolden them to use even more force and to do it again. So that's the reason why it is in our security interest to ensure that President Putin wins, because what we have learned is that he has a willingness to use force to achieve goals that many people hoped that was not the case, but we have seen the opposite now.
Do you think that NATO and do you think that NATO can have a peaceful relationship with Russia if Mr. Putin remains in power, assuming there is a conclusion to this war?
I think what we need to realize is that NATO for decades strived for a constructive, a better relationship with Russia, for a meaningful dialogue. Actually, just weeks before the invasion, we made written proposals on how to engage with Russia to try to prevent the war, to address some of the concerns they raised. But President Putin decided to just go ahead with his invasion, regardless of our attempts to find a political solution. So we need to realize that when this war ends, it doesn't mean that we go back to some kind of good or normal relationship with Russia. We need to be prepared for a difficult relationship with Russia for a long time, meaning that we need to invest in our defense. We need to continue to strengthen NATO's collective deterrence and defense to ensure that the conflict in Ukraine doesn't escalate to become a full-fledged war between NATO and Russia. And of course, we cannot go back and be dependent on Russian gas. These are long-term consequences that will be there also after the war has ended.
President Macron, as you would have heard earlier last week, spoke of a security architecture. Is there work underway on some kind of post-Ukraine security architecture, post-Ukraine war security architecture, and what would that involve?
I think we have to do this now in the right order. First of all, President Putin started a war of aggression, and he can end this war tomorrow. Second, our main responsibility, the urgent task, is to support Ukraine to defend themselves and to create the conditions for a negotiated solution that ensures that Ukraine prevails as an independent sovereign nation in Ukraine. That has to be the basis for any negotiated solution. And again, it has to be Ukraine that decides what are acceptable conditions for them. And NATO tried for many years, and even as I said, just weeks before the invasion, we tried to engage with Russia to engage in issues like arms control, transparency, risk reduction, and other issues that we need to work on. We, of course, after the end of the war, we need to continue to have a relationship with Russia, meaning that we need to have military lines of communications. We need to engage in arms control, but I think that this war has demonstrated the importance of having strong collective defense. NATO's increased military presence in the eastern part of the alliance with battle groups, with higher readiness, with more defense spending. And this is something that we have done actually since 2014. We were not surprised. The war didn't start in February. This year it started in 2014. But we need to do more of this to ensure that there is no room for miscalculation, misunderstanding in Moscow about NATO's readiness to protect and defend all allies. By doing that, we are not provoking conflict, but we are preventing a conflict, preserving peace.
So just going back a little bit to the past, do you think that a lot of governments misunderstood Putin and his intention?
I think it's very difficult to speculate about that. What I welcome is that especially since 2014, all NATO allies realized that we lived in a more dangerous world. So after the end of the Cold War, NATO allies reduced defense spending, reduced the number of soldiers we had in Europe. After 2014, we have implemented the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense since the end of the Cold War. For the first time in our history, we have battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance. We have tens of thousands of troops under NATO command, backed by significant air and naval power. And we also made important decisions now in June to further strengthen our deterrence and defense. And the good thing is that since 2014, all NATO allies have invested more in defense. So I think all this reflects that while there may be different assessments, different analysis in different capitals, that's natural when you have 30 allies. But what they have done together is to demonstrate the will to actually do more. And the paradox is that President Putin is getting exactly the opposite of what he wanted. He went to war to get less NATO. What he has seen is more NATO military presence in the eastern part of the alliance, more NATO membership. Finland and Sweden are joining NATO as a direct consequence of Russia's brutal war. And Finland in NATO means that we are doubling the border with Russia. So President Putin made big mistakes, strategic mistakes when he invaded Ukraine. And that is also reflected in the fact that he's actually getting more NATO, not less NATO on his borders.
Let me ask you a question that a lot of people ask me, which is that we've all been celebrating, obviously, the unity of the West and of NATO since February. When you compare that to the pullout from Afghanistan, to even the military interventions in Libya and Syria, the question is, why did it take an invasion on the European continent to bring about such unity?
But I don't agree with that analysis because what we have seen is that, yes, there are differences among NATO allies, and there have always been differences among NATO allies, going back to the Suez crisis in 1956 or the Iraq war in 2003. There have been disagreements, differences between NATO allies, but we have always been able to unite around our core task to protect and defend each other. You are right that after the end of the Cold War, we built down our military presence in Europe because we all hoped for and believed in a more peaceful world, a more peaceful Europe, and we strived for a more constructive relationship with Russia. But since 2014, we have seen an enormous change in NATO. And this has been reflected both in what we do on the ground with the weapon systems, but also establishing new military domains, cyber, space, and investing in high-end new advanced weapon systems to protect ourselves. And therefore also when the invasion happened in February, we were well prepared. We activated defense plans that gave more authorities to our Supreme Allied Commander, Sarkar. We deployed additional troops. We doubled the number of battle groups in the eastern part of the line. So the thing that, in a way, that we were surprised, and now this was a wake-up call. Well, we have been very much awake for many years, and that has been reflected in the big transformation of NATO since 2014.
There's been another wake-up call this year, and that's on China. Can NATO find that same unity when it comes to China, given the very vast differences between the US and, say, Germany on China's threat to Western economies?
Yes, and we have been able to do that too. So you're right that previously China was not on the NATO agenda at all. The first time we addressed China as a NATO alliance was back in 2019. But in our new strategic concept, which we agreed in June this year, we actually address China extensively in agreed terms in our most important document, the strategic concept, where we say clearly that China is not an adversary. We need to continue to engage with China. I recently met with the Chinese foreign minister. We need to engage with them on issues like climate change and many other arms control. But at the same time, we need to take into account that the rise of China matters for our security. They are investing heavily in new modern nuclear capabilities. They are cracking down on democratic rights, as we saw in Hong Kong, the minorities in China. But we also see their coercive behavior against neighbors, and then China is coming closer to us. And I think that one of the lessons we have learned from the war in Ukraine is that it's dangerous to be too dependent on authoritarian regimes for essential commodities, Russian gas. And of course, we should not do the same mistake and be too dependent on critical commodities coming from China.
You mentioned Finland and Sweden, and you had publicly stated that it would be a quick a process of membership, and it hasn't really been quick. Has NATO's credibility been damaged by Turkey and Hungary's decision not to yet ratify membership?
So far, this has been the quickest accession process in NATO's modern history. We have to remember that Finland and Sweden applied for membership in May, and then in June, all NATO allies, also Turkey, invited Finland and Sweden to become members. All NATO allies signed the accession protocols, and so far 28 out of 30 allies have ratified the protocols in the national parliaments. And this is, by NATO standards, very quick. Then I agree that 2 allies have not ratified. Hungary has promised to do it early next year. I visited Turkey a few weeks ago, and I'm confident that also Turkey will ratify, and I think the time has come for all allies to finalize the ratification process.
And Jens, my last question is about you. Your term was extended earlier this year for another 12 months to next September, I believe. Some people are saying that you are open to another extension given the ongoing war in Ukraine. Some countries are also apparently open to that. Would you contemplate staying on, or are you committed to stepping down next year?
I have no other plans than to focus on my work until the end of September next year, and that's the only plan I have. And I'm absolutely certain that they will be able to find a good successor following me.
Okay. Thanks so much for being with us. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.